Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're going to do our final lecture on interviews today. So, you've prepared for your interview. You had your social research question going in. You established hypotheses. You had a guide that gives you the questions that you're going to ask. So, you make sure you can answer your question and test that hypothesis. You've recorded it. You've done the interview. You've given a post-interview for yourself to summarize it. You've started to get ready to transcribe it. Well, now we need to talk about that process and particularly what you're going to do with all this information. The analysis of an interview is very important. And notice this is the first time that we're really talking in depth about analysis at all this semester. I want to point out that analysis is the stage where we're taking all the data that we've collected and we're going to now start trying to understand what it means. We're not going to talk about it in terms of a discussion of like bigger ideas, but we're just going to try and summarize what it means. We're going to talk more about that in a few slides. But for now, let's talk about how we analyze interviews. By the way, this is a great way to introduce you to the idea of analyzing data in other kind of areas as well. All right, now with an interview, if we have the resources and time, which we never do, if we have the resources and time, what we would do is we would go through and transcribe every word that's said. And we would have it all in a Word document, and it would be much as you might read a script from a play. But it would have every word, every little thing. But the truth of the matter is you won't have that time. We very rarely have the time, and we usually don't have the time resources to do that either. By the way, you can pay people to do that are talented at that, but again, that costs money, and we don't have money. So what we can do is start to listen through our transcripts and we can begin coding them. And if you've printed them all out and you had time to transcribe them, you can do the same, but by writing on them and doing your coding that way. By coding, I mean we're going to use words or phrases to represent complex ideas in our interviews. What I think is an easier way to think about it is we're going to identify themes in the interview. I did 80-something interviews, and I found really common codes or themes about ties to place. That was a big one. About these really important or cherished memories. Overcoming adversity was a common one. I also had cases where people talked about being lost, about being inebriated, about getting hurt, about socializing with their friends, about how they first were introduced to climbing. These are all themes that I could use. And the themes, what we're trying to do is link up themes in one interview to themes in another interview and use these to analyze our hypotheses. We'll give some clear examples of this so you feel comfortable with it. But this first round of coding is what we call open coding. And this is where we're going to go through the interviews, whether we're reading them or listening to them, and we're going to write down on our sheet or on the actual interview itself themes that pop up. And these themes can be anything that you could think of. So maybe you're going through and you notice that a lot of people are talking about agriculture. Well, agriculture could be a theme. And then what you're going to do is watch for that agriculture theme in other interviews. And if agriculture comes up there, then you'll say, oh, agriculture. And do you see how you're linking the themes together? Maybe another theme could be small town politics. Oh, okay, well, this person talked about small town politics. This person didn't, but oh, this other person did. So the themes can pop up across multiple interviews. Now, open coding is kind of the starting process. You're getting your basic lists of codes. And what I always suggest doing is you create an open code, write it on a sheet that you can keep a list of all of your codes available. And that way you know the exact phrasing and you can remember how you used them. I want to go back for a second. If you're listening to your interview versus writing on a transcript of an interview, for listening to them, you want to put the code and the timestamp. By timestamp, I mean that when you look at the recording, it's going to say at 3:27, this is happening, and then the timer moves forward. And so if a code pops up, like agriculture pops up at 3:27, you can write on your sheet 3:27 agriculture. And then you're going to know that you go back to the 3:27 spot in that interview, and you can note that agriculture came up, and you can hear that quote. You can also write down the quote at that time if you want, because if you're not transcribing the whole interview, you could transcribe just that sentence or that quote, and that's a good way to do that as well, because we might be going back and grabbing those a little bit later. So that's another thing to think about. Now, as we go through all of our interviews, we'll go through one round of open coding. You can actually go through 2 rounds or even more rounds if you want to, but usually what we do is we do that first round of open coding and we get these big list of codes. And what we'll do then is we're going to prepare to go through the interviews again and do the exact same thing, but with revised codes. This is what we call focused coding. Now, with focused coding, what we're going to do is take the existing codes that you were writing down on a sheet, you've got all of them together there, and we're going to find things where maybe we should collapse them together. So maybe we had a code for agriculture and for growing plants and for raising chickens and growing corn. 4 different codes there. But, all of those could probably be collapsed together into agriculture. Unless one of them maybe seems important, maybe they could be collapsed together into agriculture. This is just one example, but what we want to do is try and narrow our themes down or collapse them. There may be other situations too where maybe now we've seen there's a difference between agriculture and growing chickens. So maybe we should talk about plant agriculture versus animal agriculture. So now we have 2 categories where we could lump stuff together instead of 4 categories. But with focused coding, we try to make sure we have better codes. That's the whole purpose. And once you have those better codes, you go back and you listen to them again. You go through all of those interviews again, and you go through and you put your timestamps if you're listening to them. If you're transcribing, have a transcribed copy, you can write on them, but you're going to go through and note your codes again. You're going to update them. Now, this is where you really want to start capturing quotes. If somebody talks about something like a particular code, not only do you want that timestamp and the code, but you really want to capture that quote. And a quote could be a sentence, a phrase, or a paragraph, or even longer, but it's probably not longer than a paragraph. It's usually going to be a sentence or 2. And you want to write that down because we're going to use that when we start writing up about our paper. Now, at this point, you've got some themes that you've boiled down to. And what I want to do is maybe give you an example of that so you can kind of relate to it. So we've talked about a farmer's market study in our previous lecture. And I had a hypothesis that people who grew up in a rural area will be more supportive of having a farmer's market in this urban area where they all live now. So one of the open round codes that I might have would be rural life, which just means that they grew up in a particular area. But maybe as I go through and I've coded all these interviews, rural life, all these different places, maybe I suddenly realized that there was a difference when I got to the end of people were living as a child in a rural area and still live there today versus, let me rephrase that, they grew up in a rural area but they don't live there necessarily today, versus that they lived in a rural area as a child. So maybe I want to break this one code into 2 codes because there might be some important differences there. Maybe there's something about as a child living there versus feeling like they really grew up in that area. This is just one example. We could try and make our codes more nuanced and more detailed through focused coding. Now, at this point, this is where we start bringing our hypotheses into this. We can start taking our codes and start to try and understand what we found out with our hypotheses. We can restate our hypotheses about what we expected to find. So let's go back to our farmer's market example. I had some codes that specified they grew up rural or that they lived in a rural area while they were young. I could now look at those person's codes and see what they might say about the farmer's market. And I created some examples here. Maybe the person presented a memory. Yeah, I support farmers market. I went to one every week when I was a kid. So now we have this really cool theme that's appeared that we can talk about in relation to our hypotheses. Likewise, we can talk about the needs that might have popped up. And these might even be focused codes that popped up. But yeah, we need a market here. There's nowhere to get these really good tomatoes. And again, these could all be people that fell into one of those 2 categories, that they grew up rural or they lived in a rural area. And also we might find too that everybody says these things regardless of their rural areas. We might have people who live in urban areas when they were a kid saying, oh yeah, farmers markets are great. I remember going to those back home in New York City. But this is where we start to make sense of this. Remember that as we try to test hypotheses with a handful of cases, we're not going for statistical certainty. We're trying to show that there's evidence to reject a null hypothesis. Here, a null hypothesis would be that there's no relationship with growing up in a rural area and your feelings about the farmer's market. And if we feel that the bulk of the cases prove that that's not the case, then we have a reason to reject that null hypothesis and accept that maybe growing up in a rural area might influence your interest in a farmer's market. And that's basically how interviews work. Now, at that point, you're kind of working through into a different section, what we call discussion. And this is where I want to give you a quick building note. Now, when you write sociological research papers, as you'll be doing at the very end of the semester, you'll work on a very specific example. Don't be afraid of it. But you'll write a method section that says, this is how I did this study. With surveys, you'll talk about the survey questions you asked. You'll talk about your research questions. You'll talk about your hypotheses. With the interview, you'll do the same thing. These are the people I interviewed. These are the questions that I asked on my guide. These are my research questions. These are my hypotheses. In the analysis, you tell us how you found out what you found. In the interviews, we've learned how to do that analysis now through the coding. So we would talk about the coding. We would also probably build a table that talks about the percentages of people who responded to certain codes. And we could also link those together with our hypotheses. With a survey, because it's quantitative, we'll actually learn how to do some basic statistical analysis at the end of the semester. So we'll learn about that then. With the discussion section, this is where we start to talk about the quotes, and we'll bring them in to really share with our interviews what it all means. We'll talk about how a paragraph 1 might be talking about a particular code and sharing some really cool quotes on that. Maybe paragraph following after that could be people who did not support farmers markets and why we think that's the case. But that's where we would give our quotes. In a quantitative survey, we're going to discuss what the results mean. Do we see, since this hypothesis is confirmed or denied, what does this tell us about these people? Will we make sense of this in terms of the great sociological picture here? How might social theory come in to shape those findings? These are the kinds of things that happen in a discussion section. We won't write a discussion section this semester. I just kind of want to let you know where those pieces start to fall for writing discussion sections. That's something that doesn't come up until the Soc 470 class. But that's the basics of a research paper, and we'll be practicing that later in the semester. Quick note, the textbook mentioned quantitative interviews. Well, they are a thing. I can't remember the last time I did one because it's been a while. Quantitative interviews are really just surveys where you read them the questions. So your textbook kind of makes quantitative interviews sound like they're this really common thing, but not really so much anymore. In fact, especially with things like COVID happening, I could never think of a reason that I would read people questions. I really just want to do that online survey, let them answer the questions in an environment that they're comfortable with, and get out to minimize my interactions with them. Incidentally, my in-person surveys, I would give them the clipboard. They would fill out the questions and so forth. I would never read them the interview questions. So when you read someone a survey, it's technically speaking a quantitative interview. But it's such a weird exception, we're not going to worry about that. What we're going to focus on is qualitative interviews. Oh, so you liked interviews, did you? You enjoyed that? Well, guess what? Great news. You can do this as one of your 2 projects. Remember, students are going to have a chance to do projects, 2 different projects on 2 of the 4 methodological approaches that we learn. And all those options are on Blackboard. You pick the 2 that you want and you can do those. And the other ones, you just learn about them as you see fit. Recall, you can also do surveys. So you can think about those. Now, the next one that we'll be working on after this is observations. So if maybe surveys weren't your thing and interviews weren't your thing, maybe you'll like observations. And in the last one, we'll talk about context analysis, where we get into the world of secondary data analysis and analyze other people's content. And we'll have some fun with that. I'm sure a lot of people will want to choose that one. So there you go. Look, if you have questions about interviews, I have a lot of experience with them and I enjoy doing them. They're really fun. That said, they can be a bit daunting the first time you have to do one. So if you got questions, I'm here to help. If you want to do this as the assignment too, I'm here to help you as well. Those assignments are available on Blackboard. All right, that wraps us up for this one. I will see you in our next lecture series when we start talking about observations. If you need anything, you let me know. Otherwise, take care. See ya.